This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. This season, we're partnering with Democracy Exchange, Canada's Democracy Summit, taking place April 16th to 18th in downtown Toronto. The summit tackles today's most urgent civic issues over 3 days of programming, including inspiring speakers, thought-provoking expert panels, and hands-on workshops. As a Progress Canada listener, you can save 20% off registration by using this code, Lightbulb at DXC26. Visit democracyexchange.org to register today. Today we're joined by Renée Sylvestre-Williams, a finance journalist and the author of the new book, The Singles Tax. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I want to get into your background a little bit more before we talk about the book that you've come out with. So you've been writing about, finance and business for a very long time as a reporter. You've been published in the Globe and Mail, Canadian Business, Toronto Star, Forbes, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on because you were very good at what you do, of course. What inspired you to make the jump to writing an actual book about some of these topics you've covered in the past?
The pandemic, fundamentally. We got to go back to September 2020. Pandemic had happened. I'm in Ontario, so we were still in some iteration of a lockdown. My freelance work had dipped a little bit in summer, but then started picking back up because everybody was concerned about money. And hi, I do that for a living. But I was also single. I live by myself, and I was having a lot of thoughts about, okay, so this is happening, major world event. How does that affect my money as a single person? I had all those retirement questions. I was working several kind of contracts and gigs. So my financial plan was like a jigsaw puzzle that hadn't been put together yet. So I started pitching. I got some uptake with Money Sense. I wrote an article for them and all of that kind of thing. And that started off like a 400 comment Reddit thread. So I'm like, oh, there's interest here apart from just me. And I figured if I am asking these questions, everybody else, people want to know. So, and Substack was around. It was like the big sort of blogging platform. And I started a Substack in September 2020, and I've been writing about it since then. And thanks to a mutual friend, I met my agent, he is my agent now, Kelvin. We met up in 2023, had a lovely conversation over coffee. And by the end of the year, I put together a proposal and he shopped it around. And by 2024, I started writing the Singles Tax.
Were you surprised by the sort of underground interest in this? Like I'm thinking back to my government days, and one of the ministries I worked for was the Ministry of Agriculture, and we had an event about, it was a half your plate event. It was an event about making half your plate vegetables and things like that. Mm-hmm. And we had the very famous Canadian chef Michael Smith come in, mm-hmm. and I was staffing him, and I was like, hey, are you ever going to do a book for single people? And he said, no, there's no interest in that. Like there's no market for that. So I find it interesting that there clearly is an underground market for single people. Were you surprised by the response you've gotten so far?
Yes, but I will say when I started covering this topic about, where are we, 2026, like 5.5 years ago, there wasn't that much interest in sort of the daily lives and expenses of single people. But I will say in the last couple of years, now it could be my social media algorithm, obviously, so grain of salt, et cetera, but there has been more uptake in covering the social, political, and economic lives of single people. And I'm confident, I'll be confident, I say, yes, there has been an uptick. It's not just my algorithm, because it has trickled out from social media into articles in major publications. Like the New York Times has written about it fairly recently in the last few months. The Financial Times wrote a piece on being single and investing, I want to say in the last week while we're recording this. All right. And those are two very established media publications. So it has leaked out from social media into traditional media.
Well, and we've definitely seen it in the data. Like I'm a data nerd. I look at a lot of polling because of my life in politics. And we have seen increasingly, especially young women, aren't actually getting into relationships quite as much as they used to be. And so there are demographic shifts happening there, like from a real tangible perspective as well. I want to talk first about we say the singles tax, but there's a lot of ways that actually takes place in the real world. So one of them is from a government perspective. So we've seen a lot of advancements in the tax code over the last few years in terms of, queer relationships, in terms of unmarried couples. There's a lot of rights that have been afforded to people in, not the traditional relationship that the tax code has always recognized, but that hasn't trickled down at all to single people. From your perspective and your research, what are the tax implications that are remaining for single people now compared to others?
I think sort of some of the major ones is kind of not being able to benefit from one, economies of scale. Pardon me. So, for example, there's the whole spousal RSP thing, right? The higher earning spouse can contribute to a lower earning spouse's RSP, which is really great. And that money becomes the lower earning spouse's. That's theirs. Nobody else can touch it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's prior to marriage, of course. And the economies of scale of being able to buy a house, because housing is policy, housing is politics, right? So these days you need, I believe the last number I saw for Toronto, and let's extrapolate to Vancouver, because Toronto and Vancouver are the two most expensive cities that we have, income of about $200,000 in order to afford a house. And I'm assuming it's not a very nice house. It's probably a standard 2-bedroom, maybe 1 bath, maybe you have an unfinished basement. And the median income, I believe, is about $74,000, right? And there are single people who make a lot of money, but there are also single people who don't make a lot of money, right? So if you need that much of an income, which you could probably generate with 2 people, generally speaking, but then shifting it over to retirement, there's income splitting, right? Which, as you know, from a tax perspective, can drop you down into a different income bracket, right? Because you're splitting if, say, both of you have disparate incomes, disparate retirement incomes. If you're a high earning single person, and I will say, if your partner dies before you, right, you are probably not going to drop that much lower into a lower tax bracket, right? So you're going to pay more taxes unless, I don't know, you do a lot of charitable donations, or you've got a lot of medical claims to make, or, you set up your retirement portfolio in a way that's the most tax efficient for you.
I've always found it kind of interesting because I worked on the basic income pilot in Ontario, and we functionally have a basic income for couples with kids, for seniors. There's a bunch of different groups, and we base it entirely on what your lifestyle is as opposed to what your income levels are, because we're making assumptions about your income levels based on your lifestyle, of course. So there is that gap, and we are seeing that. To your point, there are rich people who are single, but most of us aren't. And this becomes an issue that we don't really put that lens on it at all. Are there other examples in the tax code where, single people just are an afterthought? And do you think it's interesting to me because the government has the data on single people? So you would think that at some point they would take an interest in this group, right?
You would think, but, in the research that I did in the book, the tax code was originally sort of supposed to be unbiased and individual, and it is still individual. Everybody has to file their taxes individually, right? You don't really file as a household, but like that line's a little blurry and all of those things, because like if you are a couple, you do benefit from it for all the reasons that we've talked about, right? Because the person with a higher earning income can actually claim most of the claims and deductions, right, which reduces their income, right? If you are a single person, you can claim all of that as well, but you're probably not spending as much anyway, just because you're the one person, right? Unless, you're more of an edge case if you have a significant amount of spending that you need to claim, like medical, all of those things. But going back to sort of my original point, like the original tax code was meant to be fairly unbiased. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was adjusted because I believe the opposition had said at the time that it's going to be mostly men who would be working, which fair. This was in the early 20th century, right? We know the situation, a lot of women were not out in the workforce until about World War II. So it was adjusted to suit. And in my research, even looking at things like wages and retirement and pensions and all of that, they were originally based upon a heteronormative couple. right? Assuming that, there would be a couple there, a man and a woman, and that would be based on that. And like you said, in the early 2000s, all right, the tax code was adjusted, to accommodate and acknowledge homosexual couples, and both married and in partnerships, right? And there hasn't been much of an adjustment since then. So we're looking at what, almost 30 years since that kind of last major tax code. There was an adjustment to the tax code.
My algorithm is filled with posts lately. I must have clicked on one and it's just sent a wave of them my way. But my algorithm is filled on posts about this idea of the disparity between single people and couples or people with kids.
Yeah.
And at a friendship level, though. So, if you get married, you've got a gift registry. If you have a kid, you've got a gift registry. There's all these milestones that get celebrated for couples or people with children that just never happen for single people. And I've been seeing all these posts that actually itemize the cost differential in the friendship over the course of time, which of course is not how we, think about friendship or choose our friendships. But at the same time, there is a big cost differential there. And, destination weddings is another one. So these posts go on about how single people never really recoup those costs of the friendship that other people don't necessarily have to pay. How much does that add up to, over the lifetime of a friendship?
I mean, it depends on the friendship. So for example, I'm very fortunate in the sense that my friendship group is a combination of single people with children, married people with children. And we're not really big gift givers, right? We keep kind of the gift giving to immediate family. At the most, there's one core circle that we will have a dinner around the holidays. Right. And we all pay for it.
Right.
We all pay for it. So, and then, we'll have birthdays, right? And we'll celebrate the birthdays with the birthday woman, and we'll split the cost of her birthday. And I will say, in sort of that friend group, we're all very kind of cognizant, and, we're not dragging people off to the most expensive restaurants in Toronto just because, we know people will pay for us, right? Which is really nice. So, it depends, but I would say if you are in kind of part of a friend group that expects you to cover multiple bridal showers or bachelor parties and a destination wedding and all that, that adds up to thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars that you are putting out, right? Because again, if you are going to a destination wedding, you are probably paying a single supplement at the resort, especially if you don't want to share. You don't want to share a room. Right. Especially if you are flying, if you're flying there when you're taking time off work, which if you're salaried, fine, you might have vacation days to cover that. But if you are a contractor, you're losing out on income. Right, you might be flying. Now this applies to everybody, so you might not be flying during shoulder season, so you might be paying more. And again, as I had mentioned in the book, there were some airlines that were charging single people more money for an economy flight versus two people. Right, so there's all these little things that add up. You're buying an outfit, you are paying for the event. You are giving them a gift, right? These are all things that you have to pay out of pocket, and you can't split that cost with a partner. You could probably go in with another friend, right? But you're not going to be like the same thing. And then there's also the social thing. Do you get a +1, right? Or because if they know you're not, pardon me, you're not seeing anybody, right? You may not get a +1, and that just could be awkward. Do you get stuck in the single and weird table in the back? There's a whole bunch of different things to consider.
It is funny too, the blinders that go on, with the +1, that's just a nice thing to do. But I have seen at weddings where people don't offer that necessarily to their single friends because they figure, well, this is an extra cost to me and the wedding. And so they don't immediately offer that. But there is a different treatment that is happening there. The other thing that I think about too is these vacation stays that people have in Airbnbs and Virgos and stuff like that. And one of the conversations I've seen a lot online is, okay, so we all go here and it's a mix of couples and singles, but couple is expected to pay the same share as the single, and there isn't a individual based price that we're all contributing to. Have you seen a lot of that in
I have.
your travels in this topic?
I have read a lot about that. And it is, again, because I tend to travel a lot with single people, I don't have that issue, but there is an issue that exists because I've read about it quite a bit. And as much as I would love to say, and I will say it, tell your couple friends that, you know what? No, we're splitting this by people. We're splitting this by people costs. You are not a unit. All right. Or you'll be like, oh, if we're doing this and we're doing this, I get this bedroom. Right. Because
right.
I am very good at speaking up for myself, and I don't have a problem going, no, this is not happening. But not everybody's going to do that. And I think at some point in time, you have to consider whether it's worth keeping the friendship if you keep feeling unappreciated or taken advantage of. Right. So, I mean, those are really, really kind of like sticky topics to consider.
There's that element of our social lives, and then there's just basic cost of living.
Yep.
I would say, like the main singles tax that we all face in life. So you cited in your book a Royal Bank statistic that single people pay 66% more in rent and 27% more in household costs than their coupled up counterparts. And of course, I don't know that people necessarily think of this, like every repair to the house, every grocery order. Groceries is the one that gets me all the time, because groceries are never significantly less as a single person, because you don't really, either you get smaller quantities of food that end up costing more, or you get bulk orders like everybody else, but it's across one income. So what impact does that have on people's finances? Because like the cost of living is out of control for everybody, but when you're just one person paying for it, obviously it's a lot more expensive.
Yeah. So because if you were just one person paying for it, so for example, you brought up groceries. So there were a couple articles that came out fairly recently that said grocery costs are expected to go up about 5% this year. I haven't seen anything about wages going up 5% this year.
or decade,
right? So just alone looking at sort of things that are going up in cost, but wages are not tracking to meet that. I mean, some industries I'm sure will do well, but some industries won't. You are by default making less money. Yeah, you are taking the same amount of money to try and cover the more things. So there's that financial stress about that, where it's such a big topic, because not only are you covering everything, like you said, your rent, your mortgage, your maintenance fees, if you live in a condo, any repairs that you have to do. If like you have to replace a fridge, right? Or like what I had to do, I had to replace my washing machine a couple of years ago. So there's that, all of those costs that you're covering by yourself. Then there's food costs. Like you said, you can buy something smaller, right? But the cost per weight or the cost per gram or kilo, or however it's divided, is more, right? Or you buy in bulk, which is fine, but there's a couple things with that. Do you have the place to store it? I don't have room to put a deep freezer in my condo. I don't want one in my living room. My kitchen is like maybe 10 by 10 or 12 by 12, right? I have a fridge. That's it. I can't put a whole side of beef in there. And if you want to coordinate with friends, that's a lot of coordination and time and all of those things, which fine, you can do, but that is time and money. All right. You can bulk buy dry goods as well, and you can store them, right? Toilet paper under the bed, giant bottles of shampoo under the sink, and all of those things, right? But it's a lot of time and coordination and money and placement. But going back to the one income, you've got one income that is covering the cost of more things. Groceries are going up 5%. So what will probably happen is if your wages don't go up, you are probably going to have to start looking for things that cost less. So you could be compromising your health because you're probably choosing less expensive items, right? So as then, if you're compromising your health, we've got, those kind of knock-on effects that are happening down the road in a decade or two. Not to mention, you've got that financial anxiety and financial stress, which is not good for you, right? So that's why people are like, oh, well, budget more and, look at this and buy on sale. I'm like, yes. Those are all tips and tactics. That's fine. We've heard that a million times before, but people are not looking at the bigger picture of what that actually means.
But this was a big point in your book where you're like, you can't actually budget your way to a better life as a single person. Like this is the advice people always give is like,
Yeah.
oh, you just need to budget better. You just need, I was thinking while you were talking there, I was like, yes, I keep my toilet paper under my bed, my excess toilet paper, because that's a huge expense, especially post-pandemic, of course. But the other one on the food piece, like I've started buying bags of potatoes because potatoes are a really easy thing to throw into everything. They're easy to process. They in theory keep for a while, but even a bag of potatoes to a person is hard to get through. And food doesn't always last forever. And the food that does isn't always very good for you. So, these are the challenges. And I think that's the other part too. And we're going to talk a lot about housing in a minute, but storage is at a premium when you live by yourself because you're not going to have a big cavernous house in most cases. And where do you start to put stuff? So, we talk about even just the political times we're living in, keeping some dry goods ready to go in case, the apocalypse happens. Well, not all of us have the same storage space. Like having a deep freezer is incredible. I do not have room for that, of course. So, it would be nice, but so the other thing I want to talk about is, and what brought me to your book in the first place was a conversation I had with the CEO of Daily Bread last year in December. And basically every year I read the Who's Hungry report, which they put out every year about their clientele, the food banks across the city. And this year, the starkest number for me, and there was a larger group, which was racialized people was the largest chunk of food bank users. But the second largest group that you could organize in any kind of way was single person households without children. So 57% of food bank clients fall into that category. And that is a group that people do not think about at all, even though that's also a large chunk of who makes up the homeless population as well in this country. And it got me to thinking, I had asked this of Neil Heatherton as well, who's the CEO, have we reached the point in society where if you're single, that's the fast track to poverty at this point?
Yes and no. I mean, again, being single is, there's 4.4 million single people in Canada.
Right.
So huge. So I wouldn't say that being single is automatically a fast track to poverty, but kind of looking at the society that we live in and the cost of everything, trying to maintain that on one salary, I would say higher than average. Absolutely. And then again, remember, we also have to look within that group of who's in that group. Are there racialized single people? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Women. Yes. Because if you look at sort of the wages, right, they are making less than $1. All right. So, and then, we're also looking at, let's look at women, for example, because I could talk about that a little better, is, women make less per dollar compared to a man. And they also tend to spend more time out of the workforce for various reasons, right? Children, if they choose to be a single parent or become a single parent due to divorce, separation, and or death, right? Caregiving for children, right? Caregiving for parents, right? People are living longer. Like I think the average age Canadians live up to is like in their late 70s to early 80s now. Right. And you're taking time out of that, right? Women tend to work more part-time jobs for various reasons, right? Again, family, health, theirs or others, they may be disabled, that kind of thing. So there's all of these things that compound with being single, with you don't have a second income to support you while you're going through these things, or to just afford renting or getting a mortgage or something in the city. So that can compound. So that 57% being single people who are facing food insecurity and poverty makes sense to me. So yeah, it can happen. Absolutely.
In your research, we're going to talk about this in a minute too, but it's a component of this. Obviously, elder single women who, in most cases, their partners have passed away and their income slide because of that. We're also seeing on the younger side of the scale, obviously, a lot of young women are choosing not to have families because of the cost associated with it and having to drop out of the workforce. I saw a post the other day about, of course, I get childcare because if I drop out of the workforce for 10 years, the impact on my income long term is much larger than the cost of the childcare. And so we're seeing arguments like this being made. But I'm very concerned about Gen Z in general because, of course, the workplace has no place for them anymore. There is no starter jobs anymore. And how do you build income and build up? Are you seeing an age-based issue with that as well at this point?
I am. So I'm younger Gen X, like almost like Xennial era. And like the workforce has never been calm and tranquil, I think, for us. And I think we're seeing that again with Gen Z, right? But now we've got AI, which is supposed to be taking everybody's job. I have my own thoughts about that. And it's this kind of weird messaging from governments, international governments, about you have to have more babies. But Gen Z is like, but you're not giving us what we want. Like South Korea, for example, they've been doing this messaging about having more kids and giving money and all of those things. But a lot of the women in South Korea are like, no, there's some fundamental structural issues that need to be addressed before we even feel safe to partner up and start having kids.
Yes.
And there was an article I saw, I think it was real, I'm not 100% sure these days, where there's some kind of like bachelor tax in Japan. Again, I don't know if it's real or not, but a lot of countries are really trying to push population growth, right, via children, for many, many, many reasons. A lot of them unpleasant.
Yes.
A lot of them racist and fascist and unpleasant. For
Yes.
many reasons. But there's a distinct miscommunication there. Like, we are not in a secure world. Why would younger people want to participate in something where they have been messaged to by older generations, that especially to racialized groups and women and to LGBTQIA people, where they are told, you are not safe if you do this. You could and will be disadvantaged if you choose to do this. Unless you don't have a lot of money or you aren't a specific skin color, this could harm you in the long run, right? You get that messaging, and then you got governments just trying to throw money at you, and not even that much money, to do this. If I was in their position, I'd be like, oh, you know what? No, absolutely not. So I understand sort of like, I understand and empathize with why Gen Z is kind of taking that moment to pause and be like, you know what? We're going to do what we think is healthy for us.
As a millennial, it makes a lot of sense to me because, of course, I graduated directly into the Great Recession. Like 4 months later, it happened. And, then, people my age, as they started to actually make some progress with their earnings, and the pandemic happened, of course, and who knows where we will be in the next 5 years. You mentioned fascism. There's a lot of that around. Yeah. So let's see what happens in that. But, from this standpoint, I totally understand what they're pausing for, because yes, if they look at millennials and Gen X, it's like, ooh, that looked rough already. And we were, and I would say Gen Z has it worse. I want to pivot to the housing sector now, because I think most people will agree this is the biggest impact that we see on people's incomes across the board, but specifically single people. So when I was in government, there was a lot of talk about the missing middle, and there's different definitions of what the missing middle is, of course. But essentially, if you break it down in any way you want, it comes down to a gap in affordability in the housing sector for different groups of people. I think there was, for a long time, when I was in housing, the condo market was still booming. And I think there was a sense of like, oh, single people are taken care of, because there are a lot of condos out there for single people who don't need a lot of room. But the condo market was also insane. And the pricing of that system really it didn't work for single people's incomes, and it hasn't for a long time. And now we're seeing a bit of a crash in that sector. But we essentially have been building neighborhoods that don't have room for single people to purchase. You talk a lot about in your book, and this is where I was like, oh, we're old friends. You talk a lot about in your book about buying your condo and how you got into it at exactly the right time. And, I'm in a rent controlled apartment, which I entirely plan to die in at some point, hopefully long into the future.
Into the future, yeah.
Right. But because we got into these housing situations at the right time, like I just got my rent notice for the new year and it's gone up however much. And that is with rent control. Like my income hasn't gone up over that time, but year over year, the cost of housing still goes up, even if you have these protections and you have, the protection of ownership, except of course, like that's dependent on your income being able to continue to pay for ownership and your mortgage. So, it is very difficult out there. And I think single people are at a disadvantage in that they don't have two incomes to pay for, the biggest purchase or cost that you're going to have over the course of your lifetime. It begs the question of who are we building housing for if we don't have housing for single people and we don't really have it for anyone else either?
I think we were building up until 18-ish months ago, we were building housing for two groups of people, right? People who could afford the nice sprawly detached house with the 2 or 3 car garage and the backyard and the hour-and-a-half commute into the city because they wanted a house. Fine, cool. And then the second group of people that we were building housing for were investors. Right. Investors. We've all read, I'm sure you've read, I've read, because we kind of we're in adjacent industries. We've all read those articles about how developers built condos for investors, those little 400 square foot, even smaller condos that investors would buy, hopefully pop a person in it who will pay anywhere from $1,700 to $2,200 a month, depending, again, Toronto and Vancouver being on the higher end, and then of course the lower ends, like maybe in the Atlantic provinces, but not by much. All right, a month, and using that money to basically pay for their own mortgage, right? Because we just came out of, what did I say in the book? Almost 17 years of ridiculously low mortgage rates, right? Where people could afford to people would borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars and, lock in for 5 or 10 years at less than 2%. Or if you were variable, you even paid less than that. All right. So you do that, get an investor condo for, I don't know, $500,000. It's less than 500 square feet. Pop that person in, and ideally use that money, and then you just kind of build up. And next thing you know, you're a small landlord. So those are the two groups of people I think Canada was building for. Right? And it's only now that people are like, oh, we actually should build something. Because I wrote a newsletter late last year, and this was due to going with a friend who was moving from sort of the outer GTA back into Toronto, right? And she was looking for condos in Toronto, and she had a budget. Her money is not my story to tell. And she had her budget, and she looked at stuff, and she had to up her budget a little bit to get a decent amount of space because she wasn't planning on moving again. We're about the same age, a few years between us. And the thing is like, you want to be able to do things in your condo. You want to have your friends over. You want to, if you have hobbies, you want to be able to do your hobbies. You might want to put a yoga mat down and do some yoga, right? You need like some kind of floor space to do that. You might want to put some people are still hybrid. You might want to put like a table in there that you can work from instead of having like your laptop in bed or on your couch, because you've got a small bedroom and you've got a living room. Like there were places that we looked at that did not have a closet in the bedroom. And the bedroom was already small.
The closet thing to me is something I talk about a lot, because I was talking to my dad about it because I'm like, it goes back to the storage conversation. I was like, I have a front closet when you first come in, and that's for coats and all those things, but it's also for like your brooms, your vacuums, all that stuff, because where else are you putting that? I actually do. My building was built in 1934, so it's actually quite spacious, and I have a very large closet in my bedroom. But again, that becomes your storage center because you don't have other spaces. And back when I was at housing, you're talking about the condos and the investors for it. Like, I think we had a myth that we were creating housing for single people and small families when really, and on an ownership model, because really we weren't having those people buy it. We're having them rent themselves to death from investors. And I remember at the time we were doing roundtables, and we were talking about missing middle, and this one woman, she was talking about how she had to have her child in the small closet that they did have in this condo because there was no second bedroom, right? Or there was no third bedroom. That was usually what people talked about. There was no third bedroom for people in these units. So it is one of these things where we just did not build it all. And we, we're going to talk about this too, but we stopped building rental. There's so many things we can talk about, but we stopped building rental because we started building so many condo units and using them as rental instead of building purpose-built rental. I will rant about that forever, so we won't go there. But the other thing I want to talk about is one of the big policies we had, 10 years ago in the housing space was this idea of aging in place.
Yes.
So we thought it was really, really important for seniors to be able to stay in the communities that they had built up their lives in and find ways to bring home supports, medical, social, whatever they were, into the home to keep people in these spaces. But at the same time, we also had a thought process that obviously aging boomers were going to downsize into smaller housing, and then millennial families would take over those homes as their starter homes and build up. Well, that's not going to happen if the seniors aren't leaving those homes, of course. So we had this battle happening where we weren't really planning for reality. And we also, because of that, we didn't actually create comfortable spaces for my grandma. Before she passed away, she had lived in a seniors building. There's one actually down the street from me where it isn't meant as long-term care. It is actually just a senior's home that people live in comfortably and actively, because of course, as you mentioned, people are living longer and more actively for longer. And we didn't really build that type of housing for those folks, for one or two people. A lot of the time it is women living for perhaps decades after their partner has passed away. And so they have a lot of good living left, but we haven't built them homes and spaces to do that kind of living. So yes, they stay in these homes, which means those homes are not freed up, which means nobody has any place to go, which is unsurprising that we have a housing crisis. How much of the crisis do you think now is a failure to build for these single, often widowed seniors?
Oh, 100%. I mean, the various levels of government really kind of got out of building housing in the 90s, right? I think it's like Brian Mulroney's government sort of just ended all of that, and no successive Liberal government at the federal level has contributed to it. The thing is, like, people like to blame cities for not building housing. And to an extent, absolutely. But the provinces are responsible for building housing. And just very, very recently, the federal government, as you know, has told the cities, the municipalities and the cities that they will provide a certain amount of millions of dollars if you build X amount of housing. Toronto, and listen, I live in Toronto. I love Toronto. I am very comfortable here. Probably will never leave, ideally. And I'm going to say this. I look at city council and I'm like, oh my God, you guys are so dumb. Right? You decide that only certain ridings will get sixplexes.
Yeah.
Right? And then now you're upset that the federal government's like, okay, well, that's not what we said. That was not the criteria for you to get this money. Therefore, we're taking back several $1 million.
Yes.
Right?
Although if you talk to housing advocates, they're mad that they're just not pulling the entire envelope because they're saying you didn't actually do what you're doing, and we'll penalize you a couple mil, but
Yeah, exactly. And like Vaughan is doing the same thing. And the mayor of Vaughan is like, well, but we streamlined the red tape. No, that's not what they were doing. That's not what you were supposed to do. You're not streamlining the red tape. You're supposed to build more houses.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just this kind of like really weird, like, combination of NIMBYism and not in my back and all of that stuff, which I do understand, because we've come through decades of various levels of government and financial people saying your house is going to be your main source of income for retirement, which is again why a lot of seniors are not downsizing, because that's their main source of income, and you can do all sorts of things with it. But there were too many assumptions and not enough actual planning, and I don't think, not to slam anybody, but I don't think there was actual work done to look at what people were doing. There were just assumptions that, okay, you are old now, you need to leave your house and go to a retirement home. But one, I don't think people understand the difference between what is a retirement home, what is senior living, and what is long-term care.
Yeah.
Right? They all bundle it into one thing, where you put a healthy 65, 75-year-old who's like, this house is too big for me. I want to be around people. So I'm going to go into a senior living situation where you have your own apartment. You are completely physically independent. There are common spaces and events, and they'll take you to Niagara Falls or the casino or shopping or grocery shopping. But you've got that built-in friend group. And again, you are anywhere like 55, 65, 75 years old and you're lovely and healthy, versus long-term care where that's end of life.
Yes.
Right. So I think there just was a lack of planning on that. Or again, and I'm coming back to this, there's an assumption that family members will take care of you. There's that whole kind of unpaid caregiving thing that comes up, and I keep talking about, because that's billions of like trillions of dollars internationally, because we're not the only country that relies on family members to provide unpaid care. Yeah.
You've spent a lot of time looking at what other jurisdictions are doing, which is something I encourage all people in government to do, because turns out we don't have all the right answers and there are solutions out there. So you looked into Vienna, Austria, which I love that city. It's a beautiful city. They have a very different take on things. Now, we have a very North American idea that ownership is the only valuable and thing that you need to be pointing yourself towards as an individual, that renting is some kind of failure, and European cities do not have that vibe.
Mm-hmm.
Vienna specifically has spent decades building housing that is either city managed or has been municipally funded as a co-op.
Mm-hmm.
And you did a bit of a deep dive into how that happened and why they did that. And, I think one of the big components is that there's no stigma attached to that type of housing. If you said you lived in community housing in Toronto, people would have an opinion about that, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And also there would be a quality level with that as well. But that isn't the case
100%,
in Europe, specifically Vienna. So what can we learn from their example?
I say, well, first we need to destigmatize community housing. There's nothing wrong with community housing. It just means that you are in a community and the community is providing housing. What's wrong with that?
Right.
Right. Also, one of the reasons why the city of Vienna was able to fund the initial round of community housing is they just straight up taxed rich people. Right.
Yes.
Straight up straight up taxed rich people, which I know we keep talking about, and Davos is happening right now, and I am sure the historians and the economists are like, yeah, we need to tax rich people, and the rich people who are taking their private jets there are like, no, absolutely not. But early 20th century, if not earlier than that, I'm trying to remember the details here. And it was really hilarious because when I was actually doing the research on the city of Vienna before I reached out to them, there was this absolutely amazing poster of rich people, partying, hanging out, and they had like 3 bottles of champagne. And I think it's the Red Socialist Party. Their arm was just reaching in and like grabbing one of the bottles of champagne, which is like representing the tax that they were paying. And then they took that money and funneled it into affordable and community housing. And the thing is, it's like the city of Vienna, their housing department told me, and they were so responsive and really generous with the information that they gave me. They prorated on income. The housing is not stuck in the back end of Vienna. I've never been to Vienna, but it's not on the outskirts. It's actually extremely pretty. Right. There was obviously an attempt to design it and to integrate it into the various communities. Right. And yes, there is housing that people buy and that costs more and all of those things. But there's no stigma to it because they just took this approach of, yeah, we're going to fund housing for people. Nothing wrong with that. And there's no shame in living in it because there was never any shame built in the first place. Unlike here, where if you live in community housing, the quality is not great. And there are assumptions made on who you are as a person and what kind of values you have, which should absolutely not be done. You need a roof over your head. You need a clean home to live in.
It's interesting because when you think of community housing in Canada, it's always we had this conversation when I was in housing about poor doors, and we'd say, okay, yeah, you can have mixed incomes in a building, but some people will use one door, others will use the other door, and like, ugh, what a horrifying concept. But we also take whole neighborhoods and we do that where we go, okay, well, this is one income level, and it's not rocket science that integrating different people of different backgrounds and incomes and all kinds of different life experiences is actually really good for communities. And I haven't been to Vienna in 20 years, but if you look around Vienna, there's no point where you go, oh, that's where those people are, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no sense of that. And it's also, Vienna itself is not that towering in terms of the building stature. Like it's pretty low key European level housing, and you don't really identify like, oh, that's where they went and did that.
Yeah.
And I think what that does for the psychology of a city in terms of accepting this kind of housing is really, really important. That's not how we do it in Toronto, of course. We set up these specific communities. We go, well, here's these nice amenities, and we are doing nice jobs with some of these housing developments, but it is still, hey, you're on that block.
Yeah. Exactly.
Have you seen in Europe, like, I assume they don't do that?
I don't want to make assumptions, obviously, but I lived in Japan for about a year, 20 years ago, and language barriers aside, obviously, there was no particular area where I could say, oh, that's community housing, right? I'm sure there were, but I couldn't tell. Right. I couldn't tell. Now, obviously, their zoning is different from our zoning, because what I really liked about living there is I lived close to a train station because I went and taught English. And there were entire full neighborhoods built around the train station. Like I remember, like I used to teach from like 3 in the afternoon until 9 at night. So we'd catch the after work and after school crowd. So take the train out, all of the things, take the train back in. There's a bakery and everything in the train station. I walk out, there's the grocery store, there are restaurants, there were clubs down that way, and there's and then I'd walk like 10 minutes to my place, walk along the street, there's the conveni, there were the fruit markets that were open during the day. There was a whole integrated thing, and it wasn't zoned, how Toronto has apartment zoning, neighborhood zoning, and then industrial and business zoning. And I know they're trying to change that, so I would give them credit there. But it was all integrated. Like I would walk out of where I was living, walk down the street, turn the corner, boom, grocery store right there, coffee shop right there, convenience store right there, dry cleaner, and the place to get developed photos were all within a 5-minute walk. Right? They weren't, and I like that area. I like that concept of zoning, because again, you can put so many different types of housing and commercial small businesses in there. And like you said, it builds a vibrant community, and nobody is singled out as being in community housing because it's an entire community.
Exactly. So I want to talk about having what's called the singleton policy lens. So you've done research. There's a Belgian city councillor who has focused on this lens of a singleton. That's what she calls it. And it's about looking at policy choices as a government and seeing their impact on single citizens. What are some of the proposals that she's put forward?
So Councillor de Jong, apologies, Councillor, if I'm mispronouncing your name. They actually got this from a paper that was written in 2015. I'm just checking my notes here. It's called The Political Economy of Single-Person Households, How Unadjusted Government Policies Affect Singles by Jolien van de Bossche, Bossche. And again, this is 11 years ago, so this is obviously not a new concept. So fundamentally, Councillor de Jong was looking at building and creating cities, large scale, small scale, but let's start small scale, so neighborhoods and towns and all of those things, through a single lens, because the general idea is if you accommodate for singles, that is that sort of ripple effect to everybody. It's, that cliche, a rising tide lifts all boats. Right? So if you make a city affordable for a single person, it should theoretically be affordable for couples and families. So some of the things were, really like having restaurants providing long tables for guests who come alone and want to eat with people.
Right.
I've done that on my trips, and it's actually really fun. Now, I'm an extrovert, as you probably figured out by now, so I can eat and talk at the same time.
I was gonna say, having said that, I'm an introvert, and while traveling, I've traveled a lot of places alone, because that's, if you work for yourself, your schedule opens up when it opens up, so you just go.
Exactly.
But,
yeah.
I become very extroverted while traveling for that reason. Also, a lot of my travels have been to America, where those people are very, very friendly and outgoing anyway. But having these spaces where you can just sit down and eat by yourself and maybe talk to other people is great.
Yeah, exactly. So those kinds of things, like one of the other points is having more consideration for singletons in the workplace, raising awareness among staff members to automatically avoid burdening single people with overtime and weekend work and all of those things. And that's a bit of a classic trope of, expecting the single person to pick up the slack for people who have couple or parental responsibilities. But, the response to that is, excuse you, I have a social life. I have family. Right? My brother and sister-in-law, who I both love very, very much, they've got 3 children. I am one of the children's primary guardians. Right? Just the other day, my brother's like, hey, listen, my sister-in-law and brother, they've got things to do. They both work. They love their jobs and all of those things. Can you sleep over on this day and just be the adult in the house when the kids come home? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. I had my youngest niece this past weekend, and I ended up in Hot Topic, which gave me the horrors. Another point that they have, that the counselor had, was to provide the necessary space to promote social interaction in new housing projects. That means providing green spaces, common spaces, natural spaces where people may congregate and have conversations. It could be just having like a really pretty laundry room. Like, laundry rooms in condo buildings and apartment buildings in Toronto are creepy. They're like liminal. They feel like liminal spaces, and they're creepy.
They're often known in the space called the murder basement.
Yes, exactly. Like, the ceilings are low, the lighting is sketch, and you're just like in there by yourself. And if you're lucky, there's like a table, and like somebody's created like a weird little library of like 10 books.
It's true.
You know what I mean? Provide the necessary, involve single residents in policy making. Right, we've had multiple books and articles come out about how cities do not cater to women, for example. And my female friends who either have physical limitations or they've had kids, right? Maybe they don't own a car and they have to take transit. We'll talk about how difficult it is, especially like Toronto's been getting so much snow, how difficult it is to maneuver a stroller on the streets, and getting a stroller on down subways, because sometimes the elevator isn't working, and again, that affects people who have physical limitations. Getting them onto, streetcars as well. But again, for single people, again, building apartments that acknowledge that single people have hobbies and friends and need space, and for God's sake, we need a closet in the bedroom. Things like that. It sounds so simplistic, but the fact that the counselor had to put forward 7 ideas based off a policy paper that was written 11 years ago tells you that it's not that simple.
Not to go on like a whole rant about the political system, but having worked for politicians for years and being, very involved in politics, part of the problem is the people that we attract to these positions do not reflect that experience at all. And if they did reflect that experience, we see this with poverty as well. Someone might have grown up in poverty, they, make it big on their own, they go run for office eventually, and they don't remember that experience anymore either. So we do see lots of this, and we do not encourage single people to run for politics. Like, of all the things we don't encourage to run for politics, single people is one of the biggest ones, because we think it's weird when people are single and have run for office, especially if they're male, of course, but we think it's very, very rare. Or actually, if they're female too, we go, well, what's wrong with her? Why doesn't she have a partner? All these kinds of things. So it is unsurprising that that experience is not reflected in our politics, but it is a helpful reminder to people who maybe don't share that experience to still think about it and reflect on it and not have to drive everything by, their own personal perspective. Before we go, I do want to talk about the fact that your book is actually not just, a list of examples of why everything is wrong. It's also actually just like a really helpful practical guide for being single. And, beyond the advice of just budget better, you actually have some really great solutions in your book about budgeting, yes, but also about paying taxes, about hiring the right experts, about saving for retirement, all these kinds of things. What's the most important piece of advice you'd give to a single person about getting by in today's economic reality? Not to put pressure on you to limit it to one or two things, but.
In all honesty, thank you. I would say the book is also sort of a bit of a call to action for people. I'm sure we both know sort of the voting numbers, right, at all levels of government, but you can't enact change just by yourself. All right. You'll see throughout the book, especially in the housing section, I talk about voting for politicians who support policies that help you. Right. So I love me a politician that actually talks seriously about housing. And it's funny you should mention that because like in politics, we love a good family person. We love a good family man. All right. Like for some reason, we feel like people who are partnered up and or have kids are, I don't know, more stable. I mean, I don't think that's the case looking at what's happening right now, but sure. Okay. So back to your question. Support policies that help you. All right. There is strength in numbers, cliche, but there is strength in numbers. And then I would say from a sort of financial point of view for a single person is sort of know where you are financially, socially, economically. I'm not going to tell you you're going to like the answer. You may not, but that knowledge can help you in your decision-making process from there. I think most of us are just trying to survive in an economic environment that really doesn't favor a lot of people these days. There's the K-shaped recession where, the top part of the K is doing super well. We've got our millionaires and billionaires and soon to be trillionaire. And then we've got the bottom half of the K where I think most of us live, right? Where, our income remains the same. It might increase a couple if you're lucky and you get a bonus or cost of living allowance, but food costs have gone up. Maintenance fees go up. We talked about if, we ever had to move, I can't afford my neighborhood anymore. Probably not.
Yep.
So two things to summarize. Leverage your political power and figure out kind of where you are financially. So at least you have the information of where you are to see where you want to go.
I can't think of a better note to end on. Thanks so much for this conversation. It was really fun, but also hopefully really, really interesting and informative for folks as well.
I hope so. Thank you so much for having me, Teresa. This was a great conversation.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.